So this is going to be our challenge solution into creating a tip calculator. I'm sure you have succeeded with it, but if you haven't, don't worry, we are going to do it together now. So I'm going to create a single view application called this tip calculator. And let's save it to my folder. And again, we're going to start from our storyboard. And this time we're going to select our background. Just click on the empty area here, the white, and I want to change the background color to be, let's say, light gray. And we need again a label because we want to show how much tips we should receive. We need a text field. So we can put number of tips we have received. Also, we need another text field to put the number of employees we have working that evening. And we need a button to calculate all these tips. So now we have two text fields. Let's again use our blue guidelines here. And our label. And our button. So the first is going to be the number of tips. So we say amount of tips. The second is going to be number of employees as a placeholder. And label is going to be our tips amount. And button is going to be having a title calculate. So what we're going to do is to make our connections. So I'm opening the assistant editor. And we're going to do our connections on top here. So let's drag our amount tips amount. So I'm going to call this tips text field. And this is number of employees. So we say employees text field. And then we have our tips amount. Label. You see, now I have a typo here. I called label. It should be label. And if I fix it now, here we're going to have a crash when I run my application, because this thing will have a connection to a different label. So what I'm going to do is also select my label and remove the connection. You can see also the dot here is now empty, so it's not connected to anything, while our text fields are connected. So this is another good example to debug our code right now before we make any running our application. So we found our problem and we're going to fix this. So how I can now reconnect this tips amount to my label here is either to drag from this dot to my label. Sometimes it doesn't work depending from Xcode. There is a bug, or I can say control and drag to my UI label here. And now it will set the dot again to be full. So if I go over this, it's going to work, but right now my label doesn't work because I need just to make another build. So my Xcode will check the code and fix itself. So if I check the connection now, it says tip amount label, which is correct. And finally, we need to do our calculate button. And this is calculate button pressed. So let's go back to our standard view here, and I want to open my view controller, and my Xcode crashed. Okay, this is a beta version, so this can happen sometimes. We're going to just reopen the Xcode. Let's just make sure all our connections are in place. And you see my function is not connected, so we're going to connect our button. But what I want to do is to make sure there are no connections already on my button, because I tried to connect something and it crashed. You can see there is nothing here. So if I open my assistant editor, and if I drag from here to my function and create a function, wait, button pressed, hit enter, and let's also check our views here if they are all correct. You can see they are highlighted, so it's normal. Okay, let's get back to our view, and we're going to, again, in our view did load function, I want to remove my text that is in my label, because right now I have tips amount. I want to make it invisible, so I say tips amount label.text is equal to empty string here, so it's invisible. Then we have calculate button pressed. So when we press the calculate button, what we want to do is we're going to take the amount of tips and divide it equally to the number of employees worked each evening. So for this, I'm going to create a function and call this calculate tips. And we take two parameters, and we say tips amount, which is a integer, and we are going to say number of employees, which is an integer as well. So let's look into this function again, because right now our tips amount is integer, so this is a whole point number. You cannot have like $20.50 here, for example, because the integer cannot have a floating point number. But for our application, it would be wise to have floating point tips, because your tips is never going to be a standard value, a whole value. There may be some cents apart from the whole numbers, so it's good to put here double. So the number of our tips is a double, and the number of employee is an integer, because you cannot have like 2.5 employees. When we're talking about humans, you can have only one fixed amount. It's not going to be half human there. So what we are going to do here is to change our tips amount label based on the type of the number of tips we have. So because we have a double and an integer, we are going to convert our integer here into double as well, so we can do calculations with them. So I will say let double employees, and this is going to be equal, and we have a function that will take an integer and convert it into a double. So how we do it, we say double, and then we pass our integer here, so it's a number of employees, and this will make our number of employees into a double. So I can take now say let tips for each person equals, and this is going to be the number of tips, so we say tips amount divide into the number of employees we have, so we say double employees, because we have converted it into a double. And then we are going to say print, actually no, we don't need to print, we can use our tips label.text. So we say tips label.text value is equals, and we can pass now our tips for each person. But since this is a double and we need to pass a text here, a string, we are going to convert our double into string. So this we are going to do in following way. We are going to create a string and say tips per person is equals, and then here we are going to put a placeholder and pass our number of tips. So if I cut this, and this is basically a placeholder where we can pass our tips, which is converted to a string here. So this way our function will take a number of tips we have, number of employees, and say how many dollars each employee has to receive at the end of the day. So when we click on calculate, we want to make sure that our user has inputted the number of tips received that evening and the number of employees. So we say if, and then we check tips amount label.text is not equals to empty string. And then if I close my if statement, we're not checking the number of employees. So what we are going to use now is another operator here that is used inside our if statements. It's called AND OR. So AND operator is these two AND signs, and OR operator is two straight lines here. So let me show you how this works. Usually the if statement checks if this part is true, so if our tips text is not empty. So if it's true, it will evaluate the code here, else it will evaluate the code there. But what can we do here is say if this is true, and then we say and, then we put another thing here. For example, our employees text is not equals to empty string. So what this means that this part should be true and this should be true, and only then the code here will run, otherwise it's not going to run. So if this one is true and this one is false, so if we have put something in our tips and we never put anything about our number of employees, it's going to go to the else statement. So let's print to see how it works. We are going to say invalid input, and then here we say print and we say valid input. So let me run my application on an iPhone 8. And right now I'm not going to put anything in both of the text fields. If I click, let me open this up, it says invalid input. So our if statement is false, it doesn't evaluate, and it goes to the else statement. If I put something in one of them and click calculate, again it says invalid input. But if I put something in both fields, it will print out invalid input as well. So what I want you to do is to find the problem in this code, because we are putting a value in both text fields here, but when we click calculate, it still evaluates the else statement. So it says invalid input. So this is a small challenge for you. I want you to find what's the problem with our code here.